Next, we have the member for Davenport.
It's an honour to stand here, as always, in the House and represent the great people of my riding of Davenport. I am always humbled by the privilege of being here. As others have mentioned already, there's a lot of people in my community as well who work night shifts, healthcare workers, transit workers, PSWs in long-term care facilities, packers in distribution centres, factory workers. They work long, hard hours. They've worked throughout the pandemic. Parents juggling more than one job, shifts. Their teenagers working in grocery stores using the money they earn to supplement the family's income. Sometimes it's a really important and essential part of family income. And often kids at home helping other kids, especially over the last year when so many kids were unable to be in school in person and were struggling. So I don't think any of us here hesitated to come in during the early hours of this morning. That was certainly never a question for me or any of my colleagues here. Many of us have also worked night shifts in our time. And I wanted to say, though, over the last few days, I've received so many emails and calls from people in my community, many of those people who are absolutely furious at the reason why we are here this evening and what this government is about to do. Because the government's going to sit through the weekend, including tonight, overnight, to get this bill passed, and people are wondering, what would merit such urgency, something we haven't seen, frankly, at all from this government throughout the entire pandemic over more than a year. Is it to help children struggling with school shutdowns? Is it improving the quality of life of the survivors in long-term care? Is it supporting the small businesses that have been in the longest shutdown in the country? Is it ramping up vaccination, supporting families, bringing justice and a public inquiry to families of the victims of this government's failure to protect residents of long-term care, or addressing rampant Islamophobia and the tragedy in London, or centering children and youth in the pandemic recovery? Is it supporting Indigenous communities in locating the remains of children who were victims of residential schools? No. The reason we are here tonight is simple. We are here so this government can muzzle their critics, can stop families of long-term care victims from taking out ads that criticize this government. And we're here because the Premier lost another court case. Again, this government is so desperate to hold on to power, and I have to say, every one of the members opposite must be just so desperate that they would do something that actually puts at risk the democratic and charter rights of Ontarians. It is a blatant and egregious manipulation of the system to favour a governing party, Mr. Speaker, and there is no other rationale or reason. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if that's what the people who voted for this government thought they were electing. A bunch of MPPs that would do anything, firing a nuclear missile right into the heart of their charter rights just so they can settle some scores, just so they can muzzle anyone who disagrees with them, Mr. Speaker. And let's be very clear. Let's be very clear, because the members opposite have talked quite a lot today already about, about making this a more democratic process and preventing, the big corporations, everybody from, the elites from running the system. But this is a government that made sure that when they changed the laws, they would slip in some extra high-flying donors at the very same time. So now their wealthy corporate friends can make sure that they give even bigger donations to pad the party coffers with higher and higher donations. So that what the Attorney General left out in his speech recently, just tonight, about the bill, is that this government actually cleared a special path, my goodness, a highway a highway, Mr. Speaker, so that the wealthy, the powerful, who profited in this pandemic when so many others suffered, could roll right on up to the Conservative trough. They have a virtual assembly line going, an assembly line of failed Conservative Party candidates, friends of the Premier, who are getting paid appointments here, there, everywhere. And I sit on the committee that's supposed to vet those appointments, and this government is constantly just rubber stamping one after another after another. We have pulled out so many of those candidates for those appointments that are Conservative donors, that are Conservative Party members, that are friends of the members opposite. We've pulled them and asked them to appear before the committee, and this government rushes it all through, rubber stamps them all. It's outrageous. This is the kind of politics that this government plays. It's a comfortable place, let's just be clear, for many governments who want to take advantage of their time and power to help their wealthy and their powerful friends. But it's not a great place for regular people, Mr. Speaker. It's not a place where tenants can count on fair hearings at a tribunal. It's not a place where small businesses can hope for fair treatment in a pandemic, or where kids who are struggling with online learning can hope that their government has prioritized them. Speaker, on Thursday, when we were brought back originally for a couple hours, I asked the government to use that opportunity to do something truly useful. And what I asked them to do, and many of my colleagues also brought forward motions or asked for unanimous consent to pass motions on also very important issues. I asked them to pass my motion to strike a committee that would help us focus on school reopening and moving that forward, but ensuring that everybody who needed to be there was at the table. The education workers and their unions, the experts, the healthcare, the public healthcare experts, the students, all of these different stakeholders, these people who are actually the experts that we should be listening to, should be part of the discussion of how we move this forward, because the government has failed so terribly so far. I mean, it's no coincidence that we are the province that continues to be the only province where schools are actually still shut down and have been for the longest time. But the government denied us that opportunity. And I'm going to say I'm quite deeply appalled that they did that. I really can't understand why they would oppose anything that helps get our kids back to school. Speaker, I get it. I get it. The Premier is used to getting his way. Many on the other side, maybe they are. They've had a taste of power. They like it. But we were not, each of us, elected with the sole purpose of clinging to power at all costs. Maybe the other side needs to be reminded of that. We were elected to do not just what's politically expedient for our party, not to help ourselves, not to save our own political skin, not to use the notwithstanding clause for the first time in Ontario's history to silence our critics, but to put the people of this province first. Their priorities, their voices. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to use the opportunity I have now to read from a few letters that I've received just over the last few days, and I have received hundreds. And I want to read from a few of them from my constituents while I have an opportunity here. This one comes from Jim Boyles. He says, I am incensed by the Premier's plan to invoke the notwithstanding clause to override a court decision about election legislation. It overrides charter rights, is completely unnecessary, and sets a dangerous precedent. And I'll tell you, this is the first time Jim's ever written to me, actually, but he's so deeply disturbed by this Premier's actions. I have another letter here from Nolan. Nolan says, and he's written to me and to the Premier, I'm writing to object to the PC government's intention to override my constitutional rights regarding the 2022 election. It is unacceptable in a democracy like Ontario that a party with minority support from the people would seek to override my and every other Ontarian's right to a free and fair election. It is clear that this move is politically motivated by a party that governs in its own interest rather than the interests of Ontario. I think Nolan has nailed it there. I want to add the final sentence that Nolan has in his letter. He says, I assure you that this already unpopular government will pay a heavy price to honest and ordinary Ontarians in 2022 for its infidelity to democratic principles and norms. I couldn't agree with you more, Nolan. I want to also read a note here from Della, a former neighbor of mine, actually, Della. There are many reasons for calling an emergency, but this is not one of them. I cannot believe they can get away with this. Unless we can take the vote to a higher power in Ontario, Supreme Court, to show that this heavy-handed government wants to rule with unlimited power. Another person, Stephanie says to me, I am horrified to hear of the Premier's attempt to silence our critics, our voices, in order for him to win the next election. This email is how I am hoping my voice and vote can be heard. Democracy shouldn't be able to be shot down so quickly and so easily. Ontario is not a dictatorship, and we can't allow the Premier to turn it into one. Thank you for speaking up for us, and I hope this email can help your case. Well, I think it did. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to read one more here. Where is it? And this is from Margaret Smith, a very, very active resident in the Regal Heights community. She says, I agree with you that the Premier should be focused on the needs of the people of Ontario, not on shutting down democratic opposition to his government. It is obvious that he is trying to control the messaging for the full year before the next election in the vain hope that voters will forget his abysmal lack of leadership during this crisis and his catering to his business friends and their enrichment. It is a sad day for democracy in Ontario. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that really struck me when I was reading through these, and I pulled just a few of them together, but was how many people, I think, actually this government's actions in bringing forward this legislation and the urgency that they suddenly feel that they haven't felt throughout this entire pandemic, I think it has actually motivated people, Mr. Speaker. It has motivated people who I think, to be honest, were, they were big fans of the government maybe, but they weren't feeling like, really motivated to get out there and defeat them. And you know what I think, Mr. Speaker? I think this is motivating them. And I've seen it today, because I'll tell you, I know from talking to my colleagues across the province that they're seeing it too. I know that people who called me today said they had been on the phone trying to reach the Premier, but they couldn't get through because the phone lines were jammed, because so many people were calling to express their displeasure with this government. So, Mr. Speaker, it's about 1:40 now in the morning here in the Ontario Legislature. And as I started out by saying earlier in my speech, there's a lot of things I would love to be discussing here today. But I think that we have to acknowledge that what this government has brought forward is going to have significant impact by the attempt to muzzle their critics. It is deeply anti-democratic, and it is in that sense, it is deeply troubling, and I think it has made a lot of Ontarians, yes, afraid for what this means for their democratic and charter rights. I want to read one more thing that somebody wrote to me, and she actually wrote to Premier Ford and CC'd me, and her name is Carol Gallagher, and she said, Dear Premier Ford, how is it possible that you believe you have the unilateral right to overturn a court decision and impose your own will on your constituents, the people of Ontario? The charter rights of your citizens deserve the utmost respect rather than contempt. I am deeply dismayed and concerned about the future of democracy in our province. I am asking with the utmost urgency that you reconsider your actions and not invoke the notwithstanding clause to override the court decision on Bill 254. Please, please do your duty to represent the people of Ontario rather than protect your own interests. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, we were elected to do not what's politically expedient, not to just help ourselves, not to save our own political bacon. We were elected to represent our communities. And, you know, I would say, maybe I think it's just this side maybe, but I think also to represent the most vulnerable in our communities. To try to, in limited time, the very precious time we have here, to do something that's good and important. And what this government is attempting to do with the time they have is it's really reprehensible, Mr. Speaker. Their priorities are the priorities of the people of this province, their voices. The government has forgotten it, but the people of Ontario have not. They aren't going to either. They're not going to forget, and I don't think they're going to forgive. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.